Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are strapping in for quite a ride, looking at a real high-wire act of international diplomacy. Or maybe what passes for it these days.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Our source material is a pretty critical recent interview. It's with the Russian ambassador to the UK, Andrei Kelin. It just happened on LBC, September 18th, 2025.
And it's really essential, I think, for listeners to understand this isn't just, a standard diplomatic chat, not a simple Q&A.
No, definitely not.
We have to look at this transcript really not just as an interview, but as a key data point. It's kind of a masterclass in, well, deflection, distortion, and frankly, straight up denial. Ambassador Kelin's words are very carefully chosen. They're designed to push Russia's core strategic goals, especially in the West, trying to fracture unity, legitimize the ongoing aggression.
Right.
So our mission here really is to give you, the listener, a kind of shortcut, a way to understand the precise strategic game behind every single word of spin.
Exactly. We're not just here to play back what he said. We need to dissect how he said it, and crucially, why.
Yeah.
We need to look past the surface claims, analyze the whole structure of the narrative he's building. What propaganda levers is he pulling? What concepts are being deliberately switched out?
We absolutely have to apply that critical lens. That's our job. To spot the techniques being used, the classic false dichotomy, the strategic use of whataboutism, that careful concept substitution, especially when talking about things like war crimes.
Right.
This interview, it really is a battlefield of narratives. And to navigate it, we need to be anchored by 5 essential, unshakable truths. These will guide our whole analysis.
Okay, let's lay those 5 truths out clearly right at the start. They're like our compass points for this deep dive.
Okay, first, this is not a conflict. It is an unprovoked act of aggression by Russia against an independent Ukraine. That simple statement, it anchors the whole causal chain that Kelin keeps trying to break.
Got it. Second,
Russian diplomacy systematically lies. It shifts blame, it breaks those causal chains, and it constantly diverts attention from the real core issue. That's just the operational reality when dealing with the Kremlin's foreign service.
Yeah. Third,
Ukraine will not accept any realities on the ground that legalize the seizure of its territory. Sovereignty. It's just not negotiable for
makes
us.
sense. Fourth point.
Fourth, elections in Ukraine are impossible under fire from an occupier. Legitimacy is not really up for debate until their territorial integrity is restored and the aggression actually stops.
Right. And the fifth one, this ties into the UK context.
Exactly. Fifth, and this relates directly to the UK stance, the United Kingdom should have expelled Kelin after Salisbury and the Novichok attack. And today, honestly, there are even more grounds to do so, especially given the brazen denial of aggression against NATO allies.
So that's our complete framing.
That's our framework.
Okay, let's jump straight into the immediate crisis then. The thing that really triggered this high-profile interview. The drone incursions.
Right. Kelin had just been summoned by the Foreign Office. This was after repeated documented incidents involving what looked very much like Russian drones violating NATO airspace, Poland and Romania specifically.
The pressure must have been pretty intense on him.
Oh, immense. Especially after those Polish incidents around September 9th and 10th. Look, Russian drone debris airspace violations, they aren't exactly new, unfortunately, but these recent ones were dangerously close. They actually forced NATO to scramble fighters, reinforce the eastern flank. It was serious.
So what was Kelin's immediate response when LBC asked him about it? Total denial.
Total sweeping denial. He stated absolutely unequivocally, we have no targets in Poland. And he insisted Russia has, quote, no motives to do anything like that.
But he didn't stop there, did he? It wasn't just denial.
No, this is where it gets fascinating. He immediately pivoted. Classic distraction and blame shifting. He didn't just deny it, he invented a whole counter-narrative.
What was the narrative?
He suggested that Kyiv had the motive, maybe to improve relationship with Poland or perhaps just to attract attention from the West. It's an attempt to completely flip the script, right? Frame the aggressor, Russia, as the victim of some Ukrainian conspiracy.
Wow. And did he offer any specifics on how Ukraine supposedly did this?
Oh, yes. He proposed a full-blown false flag operation. He actually claimed Ukraine might be using captured decoys, specifically mentioning Hera drones, which he said Kyiv repurposed to stage this incident, all to ratchet up tension between Russia and NATO.
So Ukraine is bombing its allies' airspace with captured Russian drones. That's the claim.
That's the claim. And regarding the Romania incident, he just brushed it off, dismissed it as very vague, offered no comment, because, it wasn't detailed enough for him to counter.
So
Convenient.
let's pull the lens back here. What's the technique? What's the goal of saying something like that?
It's textbook conspiracy theory, really, designed to muddy the waters, confuse the intelligence picture. If Russia denies responsibility, right, and then throws out this alternative, highly improbable theory.
Like Ukraine modifying drones to hit its own allies.
Exactly. The goal isn't actually to be believed in London or Warsaw. They know better. The goal is to create just enough uncertainty, enough noise to maybe slow down or prevent a unified, decisive NATO response.
That's the strategic play then. It's not about convincing the UK Foreign Office. It's about sowing doubt, maybe for domestic Russian audiences too.
Precisely. For domestic consumption, it plays as, see, the West is paranoid, Ukraine is deceitful. But the hard facts, the facts confirmed by NATO and Poland, are that Russian drones did violate Polish airspace. That led directly to NATO reinforcing its eastern flank.
And the Polish Prime Minister Tusk made that really stark comment, didn't he?
He did. He warned this was the closest we have been to open conflict since World War II. That is a gravely serious statement from a NATO leader, and Kelin is just trying to paper over it with these denials and conspiracies.
So his denial, it's really just a way to cover for these incursions, maybe test NATO's red lines, see how they react.
That's exactly what it looks like. Testing responses, probing weaknesses. And this whole pattern, where facts are systematically inverted, where the causal chain is broken, where the victim gets blamed, it brings us right back to our second core truth.
Let's hear it again.
Russian diplomacy systematically lies, shifts blame, breaks causal chains, and diverts attention from the core issue. This pattern, you'll see, it guides almost every single statement he made in that interview.
Okay, let's move on then. From denying drone attacks to minimizing civilian harm. This came up specifically regarding the strike on the British Council compound in Kyiv. He was asked about that, right? Because he'd been summoned over it back in August.
Yes, he was. And his claim was just a classic example of normalization and minimization. He insisted it was merely an unfortunate situation.
Unfortunate.
Yes, and the result of simple collateral damage. He tried to justify it by insisting Russia only targets military infrastructure. He claimed there was a Ukrainian military enterprise supposedly right across the street, and that was the intended target.
But we know the UK Defense Secretary publicly confirmed the British Council compound was hit by a Russian missile during a mass strike on Kyiv.
Exactly. And this is where the language is so crucial. When Russia uses the term collateral damage, what does that really mean? It's often a euphemism for either a severe lack of precision in their targeting, or perhaps more worryingly, a doctrine of acceptable risk that explicitly includes civilian buildings near alleged military targets.
So it wasn't just an accident, a one-off mistake.
It doesn't look like it. It fits into a systematic pattern of strikes on civilian infrastructure that Ukraine has been meticulously documenting since the start of the full-scale invasion.
That's the key distinction, isn't it? The pattern.
It is. And his follow-up comment where he expressed regret that, quote, no one has perished or was hurt, while seemingly okay on the surface, it implicitly normalizes the destruction of cultural and educational assets as just an acceptable side effect of Russia's invasion.
So when you treat destroying a foreign cultural center as a sort of minor inconvenience,
you're basically cementing a policy of aggression, where civilian life and culture are disposable.
Which ties directly back to our first core framing point, doesn't it?
Absolutely. When you look at this kind of indiscriminate targeting, the minimization of harm to civilian areas, the defining characteristic of the situation is impossible to ignore. This isn't just a mistake in a conflict. It confirms the fundamental reality.
This is not a conflict. It is an unprovoked act of aggression by Russia against an independent Ukraine.
Precisely. Now, even before Kelin got into talking about peace terms, he laid down a really crucial marker, a preemptive condition. He spent quite a bit of time in this early part setting the stage for future peace terms by aggressively ruling out NATO.
Yes, I remember that part. He was very clear. NATO cannot play any peacekeeping role in Ukraine. Only the United Nations would be acceptable to Russia.
He was absolutely adamant. Russia will not accept NATO contingents, NATO bases, on what he considers former Ukrainian soil. Basically, anywhere Russia occupies or intends to control.
Okay, strategically, what's the calculus there? Why rule out NATO so forcefully up front?
It really highlights the ultimate and non-negotiable goal of any Russian-dictated peace terms. By blocking normal, robust security mechanisms like NATO involvement or NATO-backed security guarantees for Ukraine, Russia aims to impose guarantees entirely on its own terms.
And those Russian terms would mean what for Ukraine?
They fundamentally require Ukraine to be demilitarized, non-aligned, and therefore permanently vulnerable to future Russian pressure or aggression. It locks in Ukraine's weakness.
So it's basically demanding unilateral disarmament, but dressing it up as a peace term, ensuring any deal leaves Ukraine completely unable to defend itself effectively in the future.
Exactly. They want to make sure Ukraine remains exactly where Russia wants it, weak and exposed.
Which underscores why Ukraine pushes back so hard. It links to our third essential truth.
It does. Ukraine will not accept any realities on the ground that legalize the seizure of its territory.
Right.
Any peace terms that leave Ukraine exposed, mutilated, unable to guarantee its own security, they're just going to be rejected. That's the bottom line for Kyiv.
Okay, so let's unpack this shift. We've seen the denials of military actions, the drones, the civilian harm. Now we move into what seems like his main political goal in the interview, undermining the entire structure, the legitimacy of the Ukrainian state and its current leadership.
Yes. This is really the centerpiece of the propaganda playbook. And it's a tactic that has remained remarkably consistent since the full-scale invasion began back in 2022. The central strategic move is questioning President Zelensky's legitimacy.
How did he frame that this time?
He made the claim very explicitly. He stated that Zelensky's powers, quote, expired last May. That's when his initial 5-year presidential term would have ended if elections had been possible.
Which they weren't because of the war.
Precisely. But Kelin uses this to argue that if Zelensky were to sign any peace agreement now, it would be null and void. Why? Because, he claims, the next elected official in Ukraine would simply reject it. It's an attempt to create this kind of legal fiction, suggesting a power vacuum.
So he's attacking Zelensky's legal standing, but he went further, didn't he? Made it personal.
He did. He twisted the situation into a personal attack.
Yeah.
He claimed that polls, unspecified polls, of course, shows Zelensky would be defeated the moment martial law is lifted.
Implying
that Zelensky needs the war to stay in power, effectively turning Ukraine's offensive necessity into some kind of self-serving political choice by Zelensky. It's really a calculated slander against a wartime democratic leader.
But let's bring it back to the actual facts here, the legal and democratic realities for our listeners.
Absolutely crucial. Elections are strictly impossible in Ukraine right now, both practically and legally, under the current martial law conditions. You simply cannot hold a nationwide election while the country is under active bombardment, while large areas are occupied by Russian forces, and while millions, literally millions of Ukrainian citizens are either internally displaced or living as refugees abroad.
And the military needs to vote too, presumably.
A huge part of the electorate is actively engaged in combat. It's just not feasible.
So the strategic insight here is
demanding elections under these conditions, under fire, it's purely a lever of pressure. It's used by the aggressor, by Russia, to try and delegitimize a democratic government that's facing an invasion. It's an attempt to make the international community pause, question their support for Kyiv, maybe even try to negotiate over the heads of the current legally established Ukrainian government.
Creating political instability in Kyiv, undermining their moral authority, that's the goal.
That's the goal. And when we look back, compare this to his previous interviews, like the ITV one from February.
It's the same argument, isn't it?
Exactly the same. It's a consistent, recurring trick they've used since 2022. It never changes. It's a foundational piece of their narrative strategy.
Which means our analysis really has to be guided by that fourth critical truth we laid out.
Let's state it again. Elections in Ukraine are impossible under fire from an occupier. Legitimacy is not up for debate until territorial integrity is restored and the aggression stops. You cannot separate Kelin's political attacks from the ongoing military pressure. They're two sides of the same coin.
And this political attack, this attempt to delegitimize Zelensky, it ties directly into Russia's actual terms for peace, doesn't it? The non-negotiable ones.
Directly. Kelin stated very clearly, Russia's prepared for a serious conversation. Sounds reasonable, right? But only if it's based on the terms laid out way back in the 2022 Istanbul draft.
And we need to remember why that draft failed.
Right, we absolutely do. It was quickly abandoned because it was fundamentally flawed. It was drafted under extreme duress for Ukraine, based on coercion, not genuine negotiation.
So what are those specific demands Russia is still pushing from that draft?
We need to be crystal clear about these because this is the price Russia is demanding for peace. First, Ukraine must become a neutral non-nuclear state. That feeds directly into the demilitarization goal we talked about earlier.
Okay. Neutral, non-nuclear. What else?
And perhaps the most critical point, territorial realities must be taken into account. That phrase again.
Which is a diplomatic code for.
For forcing Ukraine to legally sign away its sovereignty over the territories Russia currently occupies or claims, legalizing the seizure of land through force.
And Kelin sounded pretty confident about this, didn't he? In the interview, he was almost boasting.
Very confident, asserting that Russia is winning, that its position is stronger, and therefore, in his mind, Russia is empowered to lay down these maximalist, completely non-negotiable terms.
Which explains exactly why Ukraine says they can't negotiate on this basis.
Precisely. Russia isn't asking Ukraine to negotiate peace. They're asking Ukraine to surrender its sovereignty, its territory, and its entire future defensive capability.
And Ukraine's demand for real security guarantees.
Ukraine demands robust, long-term, resilient security guarantees. But Kelin just dismissed any guarantees that might come from a coalition of the willing, because he views that coalition as inherently anti-Russian anyway.
So it creates this diplomatic dead end. Russia demands terms that amount to total surrender, frames these as the only path to peace, and then rejects any actual mechanism like NATO involvement or strong Western guarantees that would protect Ukraine from the next inevitable invasion if Russia chose to launch one.
The goal is unconditional submission, dressed up as negotiation.
And that just hammers home our third truth again.
It does. Ukraine will not accept any realities on the ground that legalize the seizure of its territory. That reality is simply non-negotiable for Kyiv, no matter how much pressure Russia applies, politically or militarily.
Okay, moving on from the political attacks and peace terms. The ambassador spent a a really large chunk of the interview spinning the state of the Russian economy and also trying to evade the human cost of this invasion. This section feels like it needs a proper deep dive into the numbers he used.
Absolutely. The myth of economic resilience he presented was, well, quite striking. Kelin's claims were overtly positive, almost you could say euphoric.
Like what specifically?
He said Russia's economy is booming, targeting 5% GDP growth this year. He claimed unemployment is the lowest in Europe. And he argued that Western sanctions have actually provided a necessary boost to domestic industry. A kind of beneficial isolation was the implication.
Sanctions are good for Russia. That was the line.
That was the line. He even tried to dismiss high inflation, putting it at 8 to 8.5% by saying, well, the UK had a similar rate just 2 years ago, trying to imply it's just a global issue, not a specific Russian crisis caused by the war and sanctions.
Okay, but let's look behind that headline, 5% GDP growth figure. What do Russia's own institutions say?
Right. Because while there was certainly a rebound from the initial shock of the full-scale invasion and sanctions, GDP growth has already slowed quite dramatically. It had dropped from around 4.1% in 2023 to about 1.5% in the preceding year, according to many sources, including Russian ones. And critically, this apparent resilience, this growth figure he's touting, it's almost entirely driven by hypermilitarization.
That's the key point listeners need to get, isn't it?
It is the essential insight. When Kelin boasts about 5% GDP growth, what he means is 5% growth in the production of tanks, missiles, artillery shells, uniforms. This isn't consumer-driven growth. It's not sustainable growth that actually improves the quality of life for the average Russian citizen.
It's military spending propping up the numbers.
Exactly. It's military Keynesianism, a temporary surge fueled by massive state spending pouring into defense industries. But this causes severe structural damage elsewhere. It starves the civilian sectors, technology, consumer goods, services of investment of technology, and crucially of labor.
So, the economic boom is essentially a war bubble. It depends entirely on the continuation of the war effort.
Precisely. If the war stopped tomorrow, that 5% growth would likely evaporate, leaving behind huge structural problems. Massive labor shortages, for instance, as skilled workers are either mobilized for the front or have fled the country. Brain drain is a huge issue.
So sanctions haven't crushed the economy, maybe, but they've fundamentally warped it.
Exactly. Warped it towards military production above all else. Kelin is presenting a wartime economy, one running on immense budget deficits funded by oil and gas revenues and reserve funds as a sign of robust health. That's a classic propaganda move. It's designed to reassure both the domestic elites in Russia and external partners like China that Russia can withstand Western pressure indefinitely.
He also touched on energy sanctions, didn't he? Trying to downplay their impact.
Yes, he argued Russia is fully replacing Europe by selling its gas to China instead. He claimed they are using one pipe that's the existing Power of Siberia line and are actively, quote, constructing the other pipe, by which he meant the huge, ambitious Power of Siberia 2 project.
That sounds like a significant geopolitical shift if true. Is it?
Well, it's a significant claim. It's designed to tell Europe, we don't need you anymore. But the facts on the ground really contradict his level of certainty and gloss over massive strategic vulnerabilities for Russia.
How so?
Okay, the EU share of Russian gas did drop massively, from about 45% pre-invasion down to maybe 13–15% by 2025. That's a huge hit. Russia desperately needs power of Siberia, too, to shift that lost volume eastward to China.
But that project, PS2, it's not straightforward, is it? It's not just being built as he claims.
Not at all. While there are memorandums of understanding, MOUs, for PS2, concrete construction hasn't really started in earnest. Reliable pricing details, the actual timeline, these remain very open questions, highly uncertain. Russia needs the pipeline desperately to maintain state revenue, but China knows this.
So China has the leverage.
Massive leverage. Beijing is reportedly demanding deep price discounts for that gas, essentially turning Moscow into a junior energy partner. So Kelin's certainty that they are already building it, that's almost certainly exaggerated. It's projecting confidence when the reality is Russia's becoming increasingly dependent on a single, very powerful customer who can dictate the terms.
So the technique here is showcasing a kind of false prosperity, ignoring the long-term costs and dependencies of this pivot away from Europe.
Exactly. Ignoring the fact they're selling gas much cheaper to China than they ever did to Europe, and that the infrastructure isn't even guaranteed yet.
Which, again, it just confirms that attempt to break the causal chain claiming sanctions actually helped Russia is completely deliberate. The facts show something different.
And this fits our second core truth again. Russian diplomacy systematically lies, shifts blame, breaks causal chains, and diverts attention from the core issue in this case, the reality of an unsustainable militarized economy facing long-term decline.
Okay, then there was the part about casualties, the human cost. He was asked directly about Russian losses, wasn't he?
Yes, inevitably. How many soldiers has Russia lost since the invasion began?
Get his response.
Complete evasion. He refused to give a figure, stating only the General Staff knows the real numbers. Then he immediately dismissed the UK Ministry of Defense estimates, which suggested over 1 million Russian casualties, killed and wounded combined, by mid-2025 as just exaggeration, propaganda.
But he didn't just dismiss the figures, did he? He used a specific technique.
Yes, the propaganda technique of asymmetry. He refused to give Russia's numbers, but then immediately pivoted to focus instead on, quote, uncomparable Ukrainian losses. He even cited a specific large figure, 50,000 Ukrainian casualties, he claimed, in the Kursk Oblast area alone recently.
So hide your own losses, inflate the enemies. What's the purpose of that?
The technique is key. By hiding Russia's own true, horrific costs from the Russian people, he helps maintain the domestic narrative. The narrative of a special military operation that is going according to plan is successful and relatively low cost in human lives.
And by maximizing the opponent's losses.
By maximizing Ukraine's losses, he tries to create a kind of moral equivalence on the battlefield. To suggest, look, war is hell, Ukraine is suffering just as much, maybe more. It helps minimize the fact that Russia is the sole aggressor, the one who started the war. Breaking that causal chain again allows him to frame the war as some kind of mutual tragedy, rather than an unprovoked invasion with clear victims and aggressors.
Did he acknowledge the cost at all?
He did admit vaguely that the price has been high, but then he immediately justified it, claiming the intervention was unavoidable, necessary to prevent some supposed disaster for Russian speakers in the Donbass, reiterating the original fabricated justification for launching the invasion in the first place.
So, despite the spin, the facts remain. The war has inflicted massive casualties on both sides, a tragedy directly caused by Russia's decision to invade.
An avoidable tragedy. The immense human cost is a direct consequence of Russia's policy of aggression. No amount of spin can change that fundamental reality.
And this brings us right back inescapably to that foundational truth Kelin spends so much energy trying to deny.
Let's state it. This is not a conflict. It is an unprovoked act of aggression by Russia against an independent Ukraine.
Now, what's really fascinating here, as you mentioned earlier, is how the narrative isn't just about denying the present, but also how it shifts and adapts, how it seizes political opportunities. There's this calculated inconsistency, especially when dealing with political figures like Donald Trump.
Yes, this is where comparing his recent LBC interview with his ITV interview back in February 2025 becomes incredibly revealing. ITV, remember, is a major television broadcast, broad audience. LBC Radio often has a more politically engaged domestic UK focus. The contrast regarding Donald Trump is, well, astonishing.
What was the stance back in February on ITV?
Back then, Kelin was overtly negative about Trump. He explicitly described Trump as the originator of many of the sanctions against Russia. He said Trump was not a friend. He stated Moscow was very cautious about dealing with a potential second Trump administration. He really presented Trump as a source of risk for Russia.
Okay, so negative, cautious back in February. Now, fast forward just 7 months to this LBC interview. This happened right around the time Trump was making a high-profile visit to the UK. What was the message now?
Completely transformed. A 180-degree turn. Kelin now says Trump brought a dramatic positive change during his presidency. He claims Trump understands much more about the grassroots of this conflict. He even spoke about Russia and Trump having achieved certain common points and finding common ground.
Wow, that's quite a shift. What does that tell us?
It's textbook diplomatic opportunism, isn't it? Shamelessly tailoring the message to the immediate political climate and the perceived audience. The goal clearly isn't ideological consistency, it's pure tactical pragmatism.
What's the tactical goal there?
Look, Russia desperately needs sanctions relief. It desperately needs fractures in the Western alliance supporting Ukraine. If a potential future U.S. president like Trump suggests he might cut aid to Ukraine or force a quick negotiation,
then Kelin will immediately praise him.
Exactly. Praise him, flatter him, signal openness, anything to encourage that potential wedge within the West. It demonstrates that Kelin's entire diplomatic performance is just a flexible instrument of Russian state power. It's not about sincere belief or consistent principle.
So the key takeaway for you, the listener, is that you simply cannot take Russian diplomatic statements at face value. They change based on who they're talking to and what they perceive as the geopolitical opportunity of the moment.
But, and this is absolutely vital, despite these radical rhetorical shifts on personalities like Trump, we have to highlight the strategic constants. The core demands that remain completely untouched between the February ITV interview and the September LBC one.
What were those constants?
The core demands for peace were identical. Still pushing for a neutral, non-nuclear Ukraine. Still insisting on the acceptance of territorial realities. That hasn't changed one bit.
And the attack on Zelensky's legitimacy.
Still there. The consistent demand for elections to delegitimize Zelensky was present in both interviews. And finally, that claim of being ready for a serious conversation, while at the very same time setting impossible preconditions. That hasn't wavered either.
So the diplomatic packaging changes: positive on Trump, negative on Trump, ITV versus LBC.
The packaging changes, yes. But the core strategic requirement from Moscow, which fundamentally amounts to Ukraine's surrender and fragmentation, remains precisely the same. Unchanged.
And this relentless consistency in the end goal, combined with the extreme inconsistency in the messaging used to get there, it just brings us back again to our second anchor point, doesn't it?
It really does. Russian diplomacy systematically lies, shifts blame, breaks causal chains, and diverts attention from the core issue. The Trump flip-flop is just another data point proving the rule.
Okay, we absolutely must dedicate proper time now to arguably the most severe issue discussed in the interview: accountability, war crimes, and specifically the abduction and forced relocation of Ukrainian children.
Yes. This is where we see perhaps the most morally repugnant use of those techniques we talked about: concept substitution and the radical downscaling of a horrific crime. Kelin was challenged directly on the figures, specifically that widely cited estimate of around 20,000 Ukrainian children forcibly removed from their homes and taken into Russia or Russian-occupied territory.
What was his reaction to that 20,000 figure?
Cold dismissal.
Well,
He literally called the 19,000 or 20,000 figure funny and dismissed it as mere slogans.
so funny.
Funny. He then claimed the only serious professional conversation happening involved a list of just 339 names that Ukraine had supposedly provided, and he argued that 30 of those names had already been checked and found to be incorrect or accounted for somehow. As for the other 19,000 plus children, he completely denied any knowledge, just banished them from the conversation.
That's quite something. It's diplomatic gaslighting on an industrial scale, isn't it?
It really is, especially when you consider the International Criminal Court, the ICC, has issued arrest warrants for President Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, precisely based on these actions, the unlawful deportation of children. Kelin's denial just flies in the face of a broad consensus among highly authoritative independent sources.
Which sources are those?
We're talking about detailed reports from the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, investigations by Save the Children, official statements from the White House, and the work of the International Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children. All of them cite figures in the range of 20,000 or potentially even higher.
So what's the strategic purpose behind Kelin's denial? Why try to shrink the number so drastically?
The purpose is clear, I think. He's attempting to reduce what is internationally recognized as a massive war crime, the forced deportation of children, a potential element of genocide under international law. He's trying to reduce it to a mere clerical error, a bureaucratic mix-up involving a few hundred names.
If it's just a small admin issue, it loses its power.
Exactly. This radical downscaling is designed to neutralize the legal threat, neutralize the international shame and condemnation. If they can somehow convince even a small segment of the global audience that the real figure is maybe 300, and hey, 10% of those were mistakes anyway, then the crime effectively disappears from view. It becomes deniable.
It's a strategy to undermine the very basis of international law and accountability for such crimes.
Fundamentally, the diplomatic goal is to make the true horrifying scale of the crime seem negligible, thereby protecting those individuals involved right up to the top from justice. And this requires these massive levels of denial because the facts on the ground at the creation of so-called filtration camps, the reports of re-education programs, the fast-tracking of Russian passports for these abducted Ukrainian children, they're increasingly well documented by investigators and journalists.
This denial of massive documented crimes just confirms yet again that core operating system of Russian foreign policy.
Let's say it again. Russian diplomacy systematically lies, shifts blame, breaks causal chains, and diverts attention from the core issue. The children issue is perhaps the most painful example.
And finally, on the broader topic of international justice, how did Kelin respond? Did he show any respect for potential tribunals or accountability mechanisms?
Total dismissal. Complete rejection of any external oversight or judgment.
He was asked about the EU's planned tribunal for the crime of aggression itself, the crime of starting the war. What was his take?
He just dismissed it as a purely political exercise, meaningless in his view.
And then he made that comment about Russia's own courts.
Yes, and this is where he made a truly chilling assertion of unilateral power. He stated, quite matter-of-factly, that Russia has set up its own tribunal in occupied Donetsk and Luhansk, supposedly for crimes committed by the Ukrainian military.
So Russia investigates Ukraine's alleged crimes in occupied territory while dismissing international efforts to investigate Russia's crime of aggression.
Precisely. This isn't just ignoring international law. It's actively creating a parallel internal justice system to counter it. By setting up these sham tribunals in occupied territory, Russia attempts to assert judicial sovereignty over lands it illegally controls. It tries to reframe the victims of aggression as the actual criminals. It ensures total impunity for Russian actions, while creating a facade of scrutiny focused entirely on the victim state, on Ukraine.
It really reinforces that idea you hear sometimes of Russia operating like a state outside the normal international legal framework, asserting its own rule.
Its own authority above any international body or law. That came through very clearly.
Okay, so let's try and connect all these threads. If we look at the Kelin interview as a whole, it really served as a crucial data point, didn't it, for understanding Moscow's current strategy?
Absolutely. It confirms, yet again, that Russian diplomacy as practiced currently isn't really about finding common ground. It's not about genuine de-escalation. It functions as a systematic tool of aggression. It's focused entirely on fracturing international unity, driving wedges between allies, confusing public opinion. And its goal is always to impose peace terms that essentially legalize conquest, all while running interference, denying or minimizing documented war crimes like the drone strikes or the abduction of children.
Which brings us back finally to that critical question of diplomatic accountability, our fifth core framing point. The UK government, like many Western governments, maintains diplomatic channels with Moscow. But there has to be a principle tested here, right? How long can a democracy tolerate hosting an ambassador who repeatedly, brazenly lies about direct aggression, like drone incursions into NATO allies' airspace, and who minimizes internationally recognized war crimes on such a scale?
It's a fundamental question, and we only need to look back briefly to 2018 to celebrate context.
The Skripal poisoning, Novichok nerve agent used on UK soil.
Exactly. That act led to the largest collective expulsion of Russian intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in modern history. The UK, along with its allies, drew very clear red lines back then. When Russian state actions directly compromise the security and sovereignty of the UK or its partners, there are consequences.
So the argument is, the current situation provides an even stronger case.
I think you could strongly argue that. Kelin's continued use of blatant, demonstrable lies, his outright denial of responsibility for those drone incursions into NATO airspace, which directly impacts UK allies, Poland and Romania, and his disturbing minimization of the abduction of thousands of Ukrainian children. These arguably provide even stronger grounds today for the UK to take formal, legal, and political steps towards declaring him persona non grata.
Expelling the ambassador.
Yes. Look, diplomatic channels are necessary even in conflict for essential communication, deconfliction, consular issues. But they cannot, surely, be allowed to become completely unchallenged platforms for disseminating state propaganda, denying aggression against allies, and minimizing horrific war crimes. There has to be a line.
Okay, so let's pull all this analysis together one last time. Let's refresh those 5 critical anchor points, those essential truths, to make sure they stick with you, the listener, long after this deep dive is over.
Right, let's recap. First, this is not a conflict. It is an unprovoked act of aggression by Russia against an independent Ukraine.
Second, Russian diplomacy systematically lies, shifts blame, breaks causal chains, and diverts attention from the core issue.
Third, Ukraine will not accept any realities on the ground that legalize the seizure of its territory.
Fourth, elections in Ukraine are impossible under fire from an occupier. Legitimacy is not up for debate until territorial integrity is restored and the aggression stops.
And fifth, the United Kingdom should have expelled Kelin after Salisbury and Novichok, and today there are even more grounds to do so.
So that leaves us with a final, perhaps provocative thought. If traditional diplomacy, the kind that relies on at least some shared values, some baseline of good faith, if that's clearly missing, as Kelin's performance seems to demonstrate, what tools actually remain effective when you're dealing with a state actor that views denial and distortion not as diplomatic failures, but as core strategic assets?
That's a profoundly difficult question, isn't it? And it raises another one. What responsibility does the global community, especially democracies, bear in supporting those, like Ukraine, who refuse to negotiate away their fundamental right to exist when faced with this kind of systematic diplomatic deception and aggression? It's a test, and one source observed, history will judge how we respond to this test of the international order.
A sobering thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.